Feminism. Feminism is a tainted word. It is often associated with activism, which many of us dislike. In philosophy, however, feminism, or specifically feminist epistemology, is a subdiscipline that I have become quite fascinated with recently. In this video, I want to share with you what I understand feminist epistemology to be and how it differs from mainstream ways of doing epistemology. So first of all, what is epistemology? Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. The word epistemology comes from the Greek words episteme and logos, where episteme means knowledge or understanding, and logos means account or reason. Philosophical epistemology is concerned with questions like, what does it take for someone to truly know something? What does it take for us to truly understand something? When should we believe something? And when are we justified in believing something? The definition of knowledge that was used for most of philosophical history is that of Plato. He defined knowledge as justified true belief. For example, for me to know that there is a chicken in my room, I have to have good reasons for thinking that there is, like seeing the chicken. If I don't have good reasons, we can't say I really know there is a chicken. I also have to believe there is a chicken. If I have reason to believe there is a chicken but I don't believe it, we can't really say that I know there is a chicken. And finally, it must be true that there is a chicken. If I have good reasons to think that there is a chicken and I believe there is a chicken, but in fact there is no chicken, then we cannot say that I know that there is a chicken. Enough about chickens. Let's talk about demons. A famous epistemological thought experiment is that of Descartes' demon. Descartes asked himself, what if an evil demon is making it so that all my experiences are illusionary? My body is not really real, nor is the world around me, even if it were full of chickens. In such a world, says Descartes, even though everything is an illusion, what cannot be an illusion is my thinking self. The only thing I can know for sure is that I am still thinking. So he comes up with his famous statement, I think, therefore I am. After that, he famously makes a circular argument for God's existence to ensure that we can also know other things exist. I can highly recommend reading his Meditations for yourself. It is a relatively short read and a real landmark text in philosophy. Link in the description. Descartes' thought experiment is characteristic of the way epistemology has been practiced since the Enlightenment. For a while, philosophers hoped to find things like absolute truth, knowledge that cannot be put into doubt, and that is true universally, meaning everywhere for everyone at the same time. In this sense, philosophy took a page from the book of religion. Perhaps it was humanity's religious upbringing that set philosophy on this path. Over time, however, philosophers realized the impossibility of acquiring absolute knowledge. And out of this realization sprung philosophical subdisciplines such as social epistemology, pragmatist epistemology, and eventually feminist epistemology. So what is feminist epistemology? Phyllis Rooney, a philosophy professor at Oakland University who specializes in the area of feminist philosophy, says that before we can define feminist epistemology, we have to realize what it is not. In particular, one definition that has been persistent and is perhaps intuitive is that feminist epistemology is the epistemology of women's ways of knowing. According to Rooney, this definition is problematic because it involves the generalization that all women are the same in how they come to know something. Making such generalizations is precisely what feminist theorists criticize. So feminist epistemology is not about how things are understood from the female gaze, or how women in general understand things, as opposed to how, for example, men might understand things. Feminist epistemology is something else. An important concept in feminist epistemology is standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology examines how distinct ways of knowing emerge depending on an individual's sociological background, similar to mainstream social epistemology. Rooney points out, however, that feminist epistemology has a more particular focus than mainstream social epistemology. Feminist epistemology places emphasis on specific background characteristics like a person's ethnicity, class, and gender. And in particular, the concept of standpoint in feminist epistemology engages with the idea that people with a suboptimal social status may have epistemic privilege. What that means is that they may have more clarified knowledge about the way in which the world is organized in an unjust or unfair manner. For example, when women display anger or frustration with the ways in which they are treated unequally. Standpoint epistemology would say that instead of ascribing this to the female temperament, we should instead presume that this emotion is an indication of the way in which their environment is suboptimal. So feminist epistemology is like social epistemology because of the concept of standpoint, but it is somewhat more specific in its focus. feminist epistemology also seems to bear a resemblance to pragmatist epistemology. Pragmatist epistemology challenges the separation between philosophical theorizing and practical and social engagement with the world. Also, the core principle of pragmatism is that truth and understanding are always relative to our goals in the world. That is true, which has a real practical effect in the world. Feminist epistemology similarly believes that the practical and theoretical cannot be separated, and as we will see later, its concept of knowledge also closely aligns with that of pragmatic epistemology. So one of the difficulties with defining feminist epistemology as its own subdiscipline is that it has a lot of overlap with different types of mainstream epistemology. It does not really break with the canonical way of doing philosophy in some ways. For example, it tends to think about the same topics, like objectivity and subjectivity in the context of someone's social background. Also, as in mainstream philosophy, feminist philosophers do not universally agree on everything. There's internal disagreement, but I guess that is what you would expect from philosophers. So far, we have said that feminist epistemology is not knowledge from the perspective of women. We have also discussed the overlap it seems to have with some forms of mainstream philosophy, like social and pragmatist philosophy. And so it kind of seems that the things which feminist epistemology wants to contribute to philosophy are already covered by the other areas of philosophy. Sure, feminist epistemology has a particular focus on issues of inequality on the basis of sociological factors, like class, gender, and race. But that would just make it a subdiscipline of social epistemology, and authors like Phyllis Rooney are not satisfied with that classification. So the question remains, what feminist epistemology actually contributes to philosophy uniquely? Rooney argues that we can look at the ways in which mainstream epistemology is non-feminist to see what feminist epistemology contributes. For Rooney, this primarily has to do with mainstream philosophy's exclusion of and biases towards women. For example, according to Rooney, there is a bias against publishing feminist articles. Now, Rooney does not, in my opinion, offer a complete analysis of the reasons for why this is happening, and I think that perhaps she jumps too quickly to the conclusion that there is an anti-feminist bias in academia. But I am no expert on this topic, so I could not say for sure. Other things are better documented, however, like the fact that fewer women continue their philosophy studies than men. This phenomenon is known as the leaky pipeline. This article by another feminist philosopher, Amy Kings, summarized the data of philosophy's diversity problem. Here are some stats. Only 20 to 25% of philosophy professors in the US and the UK are female. The amount of PhDs awarded to women in philosophy decreased over time, whereas it increased in the STEM fields. And only 12% of research articles are written by female philosophers. The strange thing about this is that first-year classes of undergraduate philosophy degrees, there's an equal split between men and women. This means that the further people progress in their philosophy studies, the more women fall off, whereas less men do so. Amy Kings argues that this is mainly a consequence of a lack of female representation. The stereotype of a philosopher in the West is of an old white man, so already the discipline is biased against women. The stereotype that men are logical and women are emotional also contributes to this, and furthermore, most texts that are canonically discussed in academia were written by men. There are also less female professors on average, so women have less role models. In faculties where there are more female professors, there are in fact higher retention rates of women. During one of my university courses where this was shared, I spoke to some of the girls in my philosophy degree, because I was curious if they agreed with Amy King's analysis. They confirmed the value that it has for them to have a female professor. And personally, in these type of cases, I try to imagine what it would be like if the roles were flipped. If there were mainly female professors, and the bulk of philosophers we discussed from history were women, what would that do to my confidence as a man to continue in the field? Of course, I don't know for sure, but I can imagine that it would at least affect me to some degree. So feminist epistemology is not epistemology from the perspective of generalized women, but rather epistemology from the perspective of how women have been generalized and excluded. But there is another component to feminist epistemology that I found personally even more interesting than what we have discussed so far. And that is that feminist epistemology wants to bridge the gap between epistemology and ethics. Let's return to the definition of epistemology we gave at the start. Epistemology as the theory of knowledge. This conception of epistemology has become somewhat dubious, since the issue of knowledge is a thorny one, to say the least. Firstly, there is the problem of radical skepticism, with which some of you may be familiar. Funnily enough, philosophers have never really gotten over Descartes' thought experiment. It is always possible that nothing of what we think we know is actually the case. That the universe is just fundamentally different from anything we know in our current paradigm. The problem of induction as well, that was raised by the philosopher David Hume, calls into question our fundamental certainties, as according to him we cannot even be sure that things like cause and effect exist. This is a good video about that topic. So philosophers have historically called into question our most basic intuitions about the world, and although many philosophers have tried to answer them, these attempts always seem sort of half-baked. There's also the issue of the definition of knowledge. Philosophers used to employ a 2000-year-old definition originated by Plato, that knowledge is justified through belief. However, in 1963, a man named Edmund Gettier came along and showed that there is a thought experiment which makes this definition insufficient. Philosophers nowadays disagree on whether there is a good solution to Gettier, and here is a good video on that topic. Because of these problems, some argue that the definition of epistemology should shift from theory of knowledge to a theory of understanding. Already you can see how this brings in standpoint epistemology, but it also draws in ethics in an interesting way. Epistemology has historically focused on knowledge that I want to know that I exist, that others are also conscious, that 1 and 1 equals 2, that something costs something else, and so on. But there are other forms of knowledge. For example, knowledge how. Knowledge how to ride a bike, how to write an essay, or how to make your partner happy. Rooney, the feminist philosopher we discussed earlier, argues that purely focusing on knowledge that obscures the fact that we make normative distinctions between different types of knowledge. For example, the knowledge of how to have good hygiene or how to make your partner happy is clearly more important than the knowledge that there are X many grains of sand on a particular beach. We might also speak of knowledge that is in some way bad to have. An example that is often given is that during the Second World War, scientists tried to create a hybrid between chickenpox and Ebola and to aerosolize it, which means to make it distributable by plane. Pursuing this type of knowledge is clearly ethically problematic, whereas pursuing the knowledge of, let's say, how to cure cancer is clearly ethically praiseworthy. So even in science, and perhaps especially in science, ethical considerations undergird the pursuit of knowledge. Knowledge that is also not so clear-cut. It is heavily embedded in our human psychology. For example, our certainty of our knowledge depends on what the stakes are that our knowledge is correct. For example, imagine the following scenario. A friend asks you if tomorrow's exam starts at 10 AM, and you confidently reply, yes, it's at 10 AM, I saw it on the schedule. And they then follow up, thanks, I was scared to mess this up, because missing this exam would mean I fail the course and delay my studies by a year. Suddenly, you might feel the urge to double check that the exam really is at 10 AM. In other words, when the stakes are raised, our confidence in our knowledge that we have good reason to be perfectly confident about, becomes unstable. Feminist epistemology has introduced the term value epistemology. Value epistemology relies on the recognition that knowledge that is always embedded in questions of ethics. Epistemology is not just subject S knows that P if their reasons for belief are justified and P is true, but also S knows that P, or how to do Q, because P or Q is relevant to them, the pragmatic reasons, and their knowledge of P reflects in some way on their moral decisions to come to that knowledge. This is already a much more human and holistic way of thinking about knowledge, and aligns better with the idea that knowledge is really understanding. As already mentioned, feminist philosophers also focus specifically on certain sociological factors like gender, class, and race. And they make the point that people who are worse off may have epistemic privilege with regard to the state of the world. Hence, we can also add these factors to knowledge that subject S knows that P or how to do Q because of their social status. And conversely, other subjects do not know that P or how to do Q because of their social status. So we see how a conception of epistemology as the theory of universal or objective knowledge is kind of problematic. Mainstream epistemology has responded to the feminist conception of epistemology by pointing out the problem of relativism. If knowledge depends on the details of one's cultural and historical background, then, given the infinite variations between people, there is an infinity of potential knowledge. There is an explosion, in other words, of the types of knowledge and perspectives that are possible. How do we decide what details to include and exclude from our conception of knowledge? The feminist response to this is that mainstream epistemology is already relativized. It also decides to stop at a particular conception of knowledge and a particular way of doing philosophy. And it does so in a way that is relatively arbitrary. The level at which mainstream philosophy stops also just so happens to be a very abstract level. And that is another critique that feminist philosophers have of mainstream epistemology. As we already said, since the Enlightenment, the primary goal in epistemology was to reach some universal and objective knowledge. This goal still echoes in today's practices. One of the primary tools of philosophers is thought experiments. Thought experiments tend to be very abstract. You might be familiar with the famous thought experiment known as Plato's allegory of the cave. In this allegory, a group of prisoners has been chained in a dark cave since birth, unable to move their heads. Their entire world consists of shadows cast on the cave wall in front of them, created by objects passing in front of a fire behind them. For these prisoners, the shadows are not just images. They represent the whole of reality as they know it. One day, a prisoner is freed from their chains and leaves the cave. At first, he is blinded by the light of the fire, and even more so when he is brought out into the sunlight. Gradually, his eyes adjust and he begins to see the true world, the objects, the colors, and light that were completely hidden from him before. He realizes that the shadows in the cave were merely illusions, distorted reflections of a far richer and more complex reality. The freed prisoner returns to the cave to share this truth with the others. But when he tells them that the shadows are not reality, they ridicule and reject him. To the prisoners, the freed man's descriptions sound absurd and incomprehensible. They refuse to believe him and prefer to remain in the familiarity of their shadow world. This thought experiment wants to teach us the value of openness to new experiences and ideas, and to think for oneself rather than being chained to the group, which prefers to remain ignorant. Now, one might object to such a thought experiment by asking some questions, like, who are these people? Where were they born? Why are they chained? Where is this cave? And who are the people outside the cave? So, in other words, there seems to be a massive generalization in the thought experiment that most people will not dare to think for themselves, whereas certain brave individuals do, and they are rejected. But obviously, in the real world, there are many social and environmental factors that contribute to this phenomenon if it even ever occurs. Can we really learn any lesson from such an abstract allegory? This would be precisely the feminist critique. Philosophers will generally reject questions about such details and want you to focus on the abstract level of conception. However, to come back to the concept of standpoint epistemology, all the varieties of perspectives and details of an individual situation are relevant in order to gain an understanding of things. They are the world we live in. Now, this may relativize the conclusions we reach to an indefinite extent, but we should realize that no matter which level of analysis we choose, our conclusions are going to be relative to that level of analysis. And the feminist argument would be that a more detailed, embodied, personal, and socially informed level of analysis is, in fact, better philosophy. So in conclusion, what is feminist epistemology? 1. It is not knowing as women know. 2. It is similar to mainstream philosophy in that it thinks about the same topics, and specifically shares similarities with social and pragmatic epistemology. 3. It is specifically interested in how the exclusion of women in feminist philosophy has shaped the discipline. And 4. It bridges the gap between ethics and epistemology by emphasizing the importance of values and social background in reaching knowledge, or better, understanding. A final note with regard to relativism, because this sometimes comes up when I speak with people. And this note is that relativism is not subjectivism. To illustrate the difference, let me give you an analogy. Imagine people in different locations discussing the weather. Relativism asserts that what is true about the weather depends on the context. In this case, the location. The statement, "it is raining," can be true in one place and false in another. For example, in Amsterdam it might be raining, so "it is raining" is true. In Madrid it might be sunny, so "it is raining" is false. The truth of the claim "it is raining" is relative to the location where it is being evaluated. In relativism, truth depends on a shared framework, like everyone agreeing on the location they are discussing. Subjectivism, on the other hand, says that truth is determined solely by the individual's perception or belief, regardless of any shared or objective framework. For example, one person might believe it is raining because they like rain and want it to be true, even if they are indoors and it isn't raining outside. Another person might believe it is not raining simply because they dislike the idea of rain, even if they are standing in the middle of a storm. In subjectivism, truth becomes entirely individual and detached from external realities or shared contexts. So we should not make the mistake to think that the problem of relativism in feminist epistemology necessarily leads to complete subjectivism. Feminist epistemology does not reject the possibility of shared truths. Instead, it broadens the criteria for truth-seeking by insisting on the inclusion of embodied, socially informed and ethically reflective perspectives. This concludes this video essay on feminist epistemology. Let me know what you think of feminist epistemology in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.